Section 1. The crisis unfolds. February 2022. Prices triple overnight. In February 2022, farmers across the American heartland opened their emails to find invoices that didn't make sense. Fertilizer prices had tripled. Some had quadrupled. Orders placed months earlier were being canceled or renegotiated. What had cost $210 per ton in 2020 now demanded $879 or more. For farmers operating on razor-thin margins, this wasn't just a price increase, it was an existential threat. The culprit was potash, a fertilizer so fundamental to modern agriculture that most consumers have never heard of it. But America's farmers know it intimately. It's the nutrient that strengthens plant roots, improves drought resistance, and helps crops withstand disease. Without it, yields collapse. What happened in early 2022 wasn't simply a market fluctuation. It was a supply shock that exposed a vulnerability at the heart of American agriculture. The United States grows more food than almost any nation on Earth, yet it depends almost entirely on foreign countries for one of the three essential nutrients that make that abundance possible. Section 2. What is potash and why it matters? 91% imported, 85% from Canada alone. Potash is a potassium-rich salt mined from ancient underground deposits, the remnants of prehistoric seas that evaporated millions of years ago. In agricultural terms, it's 1/3 of the holy trinity of plant nutrition: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. While nitrogen makes plants grow and phosphorus builds strong roots, potassium is the nutrient that does everything else. It regulates water uptake in plants, activates enzymes essential for photosynthesis, strengthens cell walls, and improves crop quality. For staple crops like corn, wheat, and soybeans, potassium is non-negotiable. Without adequate potassium, yields drop by 30 to 50%. The problem is that American soil doesn't naturally replenish potassium fast enough to support modern industrial farming. Every harvest removes potassium from the soil. A typical corn crop pulls out roughly 120 pounds of potassium per acre. Without replacement, soil becomes depleted within a few growing seasons. That means farmers must continuously add potassium back to their fields year after year to maintain productivity. Here's where the vulnerability emerges. The United States imports 91% of its potash. 85% of that comes from a single source: Canada, specifically the massive potash deposits beneath Saskatchewan. Domestic production accounts for less than 10% of consumption, drawn mostly from aging facilities in New Mexico and Utah that haven't seen significant expansion in decades. This import dependence wasn't a secret, but until 2022, the system worked smoothly enough that warnings seemed academic. Then, in the span of a few weeks, the entire system seized up. Section 3. The perfect storm. Russia plus Belarus equals 40% of global potash exports. The potash crisis was the culmination of multiple geopolitical shocks that converged with devastating precision. The first tremors began in 2021, when the European Union and Canada imposed sanctions on Belarus following President Alexander Lukashenko's brutal crackdown on political opposition. Belarus, home to some of the world's largest potash reserves, was abruptly cut off from Western markets. That removed roughly 12 million tons of annual potash exports from the global supply chain, about 17% of world trade. Then came February 24, 2022. Russia invaded Ukraine, triggering the largest military conflict in Europe since World War II. Russia is one of the world's largest fertilizer exporters, producing not only potash, but also vast quantities of nitrogen and phosphate fertilizers. Western nations imposed sweeping economic sanctions on Russia, targeting its financial system and strategic industries. Russia responded by restricting its own fertilizer exports. Even though the United States initially exempted Russian fertilizers from sanctions, the practical effect was the same. Shipping companies refused to handle Russian cargo, insurance became prohibitively expensive, and banks wouldn't process payments. Russian potash effectively vanished from Western markets. The situation worsened when China, nervous about its own food security and facing domestic fertilizer shortages, imposed export restrictions on phosphates and other fertilizers in late 2021. China produces about 1/3 of the world's phosphate fertilizers, and its decision to keep those supplies at home sent shockwaves through global markets. Suddenly, it wasn't just potash. All three major fertilizer types were in crisis simultaneously. Global potash trade contracted by nearly 30% almost overnight. Remaining suppliers couldn't ramp up production fast enough to fill the gap. Demand remained constant, but supply had collapsed, and American farmers, dependent on imports and locked into planting schedules, had no choice but to pay. Section 4. Sticker shock on the farm. Fertilizer, 36% of corn production costs. For American farmers, the price shock was immediate and brutal. Take a typical corn farmer in Iowa working 2,000 acres. Before the crisis, fertilizer represented represented about 22% of total production costs. That farmer might spend around $70,000 annually on all fertilizers. When potash prices quadrupled and nitrogen prices tripled, that $70,000 line item exploded to nearly $200,000. That's an increase of $130,000, absorbed entirely by the farmer. The economic pressure intensified because farmers couldn't simply walk away. By the time fertilizer prices spiked in early 2022, most farmers had already committed to planting schedules, locked in seed purchases, and arranged financing for the growing season. Many had forward contracted portions of their harvest at prices set months earlier. Backing out wasn't an option. They had to plant, which meant they had to buy fertilizer, no matter the cost. According to agricultural economists at the University of Illinois, fertilizer costs for corn production jumped by 110% between 2021 and 2022. For a farmer planting corn, fertilizer suddenly accounted for 36% of total production costs, the single largest expense, surpassing even land rent. The crisis hit smaller and mid-sized operations especially hard. Large corporate farms could leverage economies of scale and better access to credit, but family farms operating on tight cash flows faced agonizing decisions. Some depleted savings built up over years. Others took on additional debt. A few simply cut back on fertilizer applications, accepting reduced yields in hopes of surviving until markets normalized. The financial strain rippled through rural communities. Equipment dealers reported delayed purchases. Main Street businesses that depend on farm income braced for difficult times. Section 5. Farmers fight back. Soybean acres up 4%. Corn acres at 5-year low. American farmers didn't just absorb the crisis. They adapted with remarkable speed. When potash prices made traditional corn rotations economically unviable, farmers shifted strategies. The most immediate response was crop rotation. Corn demands substantial fertilizer inputs every year. Soybeans, by contrast, require far less potassium and actually fix nitrogen in the soil. USDA planting data from 2022 and 2023 tells the story. Corn acreage dropped to a 5-year low, while soybean plantings increased by 4%. Farmers were making calculated trade-offs. Soybeans typically generate lower revenue per acre than corn, but when fertilizer costs explode, lower input requirements make soybeans more profitable. Precision agriculture became another critical tool. Farmers invested in soil testing technology that maps nutrient levels field by field. Instead of applying fertilizer uniformly across entire farms, they used variable rate application equipment to deliver potash only where soil tests showed deficiencies. This allowed them to cut total fertilizer use by 20 to 30% without sacrificing yields. The technology wasn't new, but the crisis made it economically essential. Some farmers turned to organic alternatives. Chicken litter, composted manure, and other organic amendments contain potassium, and prices for these materials remained relatively stable. Farmers in regions with access to livestock operations capitalized on this advantage. But organic amendments are bulkier and more expensive to transport than concentrated fertilizers, and nutrient content varies, making precise application difficult. Perhaps the riskiest strategy was simply applying less fertilizer and hoping for the best. Agronomists call this mining the soil, drawing down nutrient reserves without replacing them. In the short term, yields might hold up, especially in fields with naturally fertile soil. But over time, soil depletion leads to declining productivity. Farmers who cut back knew they were gambling, trading future yields for immediate survival. What's remarkable is how quickly these adaptations occurred. Farmers rewrote planting plans, adopted new technologies, and fundamentally rethought fertilizer management, all within a single growing season. Section 6. The government and industry response. Two companies control nearly all North American potash. As fertilizer prices surged, the federal government faced intense pressure to intervene. In September 2022, the U.S. Department of Agriculture announced a $250 million grant program aimed at supporting domestic fertilizer production, targeting independent producers developing innovative fertilizer technologies with the explicit goal of reducing America's reliance on imports. The market concentration issue wasn't theoretical. Two companies, Nutrien and Mosaic, control nearly all potash production in North America. Nutrien, a Canadian firm, operates the vast majority of Saskatchewan's potash mines. Mosaic runs facilities in Canada and New Mexico. Together, these companies dominate pricing and supply, a reality that agricultural groups have criticized for years. The crisis amplified those concerns, with some farmers arguing that companies exploited the shortage to maximize profits. The Treasury Department made a critical decision. Unlike the European Union and Canada, the United States chose not to sanction Russian fertilizers, arguing that sanctioning fertilizers would drive global food prices even higher and worsen hunger in developing countries. But even without formal sanctions, Russian fertilizer trade with the U.S. collapsed due to banking restrictions and insurance complications. The Department of Energy classified potash as a critical mineral under the Energy Act of 2020. This designation signals federal recognition that potash is strategically important and opens the door to federal support for domestic mining projects and streamlined permitting. However, the core structural issue remained. America still imports the vast majority of its potash and still lacks the domestic production capacity to insulate itself from future shocks. Meanwhile, innovation accelerated. The fertilizer crisis spurred investment in alternative technologies. Companies like Pivot Bio developed nitrogen-fixing microorganisms that colonize plant roots. Research teams at universities investigated potassium-solubilizing bacteria that could help plants access potassium locked in soil minerals. Enhanced efficiency fertilizers using special coatings to slow nutrient release gained attention, reducing waste by matching nutrient availability to plant uptake patterns. Venture capital flowed into agricultural biotech, with funding exceeding $1 billion since 2021, though translating laboratory breakthroughs into products that work at commercial scale remains slow and expensive. Section 7. Bringing production home. First new U.S. potash mine in 60 years. For many observers, the most straightforward solution is simply mining domestic reserves. The United States has substantial potash deposits, particularly in the Michigan Basin and Utah's Paradox Basin. The problem isn't geological, it's economic. Developing new mines requires billions in capital, years of permitting, and uncertain returns in a market dominated by low-cost Canadian producers. Michigan Potash Company is attempting what no company has managed in 60 years, opening a brand new potash mine in the United States. In 2023, the Department of Energy announced a $1.26 billion loan guarantee to support the project. The mine, located near Evart, Michigan, would tap into the massive Salina Formation beneath the Great Lakes region. If successful, Michigan Potash could produce up to 240,000 tons annually, enough to supply roughly 3% of current U.S. consumption. The challenges are formidable. Potash mining is capital-intensive, requiring deep shafts, complex extraction systems, and extensive processing facilities. Environmental permitting can drag on for years, and the economics are precarious. If global potash prices drop, new mines struggle to compete with established low-cost producers. Other domestic projects face similar hurdles. Utah companies have explored reopening old Paradox Basin facilities. New Mexico's operations continue at modest scale, constrained by aging infrastructure. Some analysts question whether domestic production is even the right goal. Canada is a stable democratic ally with whom the U.S. maintains deeply integrated trade. Why spend billions developing high-cost domestic mines when reliable imports are available? The counter-argument centers on resilience. Relying on any single source creates vulnerability. During the 2022 crisis, Canada prioritized its own farmers and imposed export restrictions, a reminder that even allies act in their own interests when supplies tighten. The debate reflects competing visions. Should agriculture leverage global trade to maximize efficiency or prioritize self-reliance, even at higher cost? Section 8. The lasting impact and the road ahead. 2025. Prices still 21% above pre-crisis levels. By early 2025, the acute crisis had passed. Potash prices retreated from their peaks as supply chains partially recovered. But normal didn't mean a return to the old normal. Prices stabilized at levels still 21% higher than pre-crisis averages. Farmers who had hoped the spike was temporary adjusted their long-term budgets, accepting that fertilizer would remain a larger share of costs indefinitely. The crisis left behind permanent shifts in farming practices. Precision agriculture adoption surged. Soil testing became an annual ritual. Farmers who had relied on generic recommendations started treating nutrient management as a science. Crop rotation patterns changed too. The swing toward soybeans moderated as prices declined, but corn acreage didn't fully recover. Farmers had rediscovered the economic logic of diversified rotations and stayed with more flexible planting strategies. Perhaps the most significant long-term impact is psychological. Before 2022, farmers viewed fertilizer as boring and reliable. The crisis shattered that complacency. Farmers now monitor fertilizer markets like weather forecasts, understanding that supply shocks can materialize with little warning. More farmers lock in contracts early, diversify suppliers, and maintain reserves when finances allow. As 2026 unfolds, American farmers face a landscape transformed and new uncertainties. Potash markets remain volatile, sensitive to geopolitical developments farmers can't control. Domestic production initiatives move forward, but slowly. Michigan potash won't reach full production for years. Innovation continues, but translating research into field-ready solutions takes time. Climate change adds another dimension, with extreme weather stressing crops and complicating fertilizer management. For farmers, the path forward involves balancing multiple priorities, maintaining productivity while managing unpredictable costs, adopting sustainable practices while maximizing yields, and navigating technological change without losing sight of fundamental agronomic principles. The broader food system faces questions too. Should the U.S. treat fertilizers like strategic petroleum reserves? Should antitrust enforcement break up market concentration? Should trade policy prioritize self-sufficiency or global openness? What's clear is that the old assumptions no longer hold. The era of cheap, abundant fertilizer appears to be over, replaced by a more volatile regime where prices swing in response to geopolitical events and market dynamics. American farmers proved they can adapt to that volatility, but adaptation shouldn't be mistaken for a solution. The structural vulnerabilities remain, and without concerted effort to address them, the next crisis is a matter of when, not if. The ground beneath America's farms has shifted. Soil that once seemed inexhaustible now reveals its fragility. Supply chains that appeared reliable now show their weak points. The fertilizer crisis was a wake-up call. Whether America heeds it will determine not just the future of agriculture, but the resilience of the entire food system that feeds 330 million Americans and millions more around the world. The story doesn't end here. It's still being written in fields across the heartland, in research laboratories, in corporate boardrooms, and in policy debates. What happens next depends on choices made today by farmers, companies, policymakers, and consumers increasingly aware that the food on their tables depends on nutrients mined from the earth, often thousands of miles away.